So one of the huge questions is, on the one hand, you have these very tough China hawk national security officials. On the other hand, you have Elon Musk. Is he going to try and temper Trump and get Trump to return to his phase one of his China policy last time around, which was much more accommodating?
Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Ben Bland, Director of the Asia Pacific Programme here, standing in for Bronwyn Maddox, who's in the US, fittingly, this week. The re-election of Donald Trump as US President has huge implications for America's relationships all around the world, above all with China. There's already a bipartisan consensus in the US that China is the pacing challenge to American global leadership and competitiveness at home. Donald Trump himself helped to shape this tougher stance on China during his first administration. And ahead of his second term, Trump has promised to impose even higher tariffs on Chinese goods, and he's already nominated several key China hawks to security and foreign policy roles in his cabinet. But we also know that President Trump admires strongmen leaders like China's Xi Jinping, and that he's extremely transactional and unpredictable, both by nature and as his modus operandi. Trump said recently, for example, that he thinks Xi respects him precisely because he's crazy. So what kind of China policy will we see in Trump's second term? How will China react to Donald Trump's re-election? And what does the trajectory of US-China relations look like for the next 4 years? I'm joined by three great guests to address these vital questions. Returning to the podcast is my colleague Yu Jie, our Senior Research Fellow on China at Chatham House. Welcome back, Yu Jie.
Well, delighted to be back, Ben.
Joining me down the line from Oxford is Professor Rana Mitter, the ST Lee Chair in US-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. Great to have you too, Rana.
Good to be here with you, Ben.
And last but not least, joining us from Washington, D.C. is my former colleague, my former boss at the Financial Times, Demetri Sevastopulo, who is the FT's US-China correspondent. Good to see you again, Demetri.
Great to be with you, Ben, and be kind to me. I hope I was a good boss.
Well, let's not go there, but let's go straight into the Trump administration, and hopefully he'll be kind to America and kind to the world. Demetri, we know that President Trump has started to make initial appointments to his cabinet, and there have been some key picks, I think, when it comes to China policy. Can you tell us who these key nominations are at this stage and what they might tell us about how President Trump is likely to deal with China in the next 4 and a bit years?
Absolutely. So I'll give you a sense of my take on the different nominees, but I'm going to put a big asterisk beside that, and I'll explain why in a couple of minutes. So if you look at the key figures he's nominated so far, I would say National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, a former Green Beret who serves in Congress now. He's a strong China hawk. He says China is an existential threat to the US, and the US should shift more resources to the Indo-Pacific. Very clear. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, arguably the first vocal China hawk in the US Congress, who has been sanctioned by China at least once and possibly even twice, if I'm not mistaken, for his stance on Hong Kong human rights and his criticism of Beijing across the board. His nominee for Secretary of Defense is less well known. He's a Fox News personality called Pete Hegseth. He is definitely a China hawk, but how deeply his beliefs run, we don't really know because we haven't heard a huge amount about him in the past, to be quite frank. And his CIA director, John Ratcliffe, who formerly served as the director of national intelligence, a former congressman, also a China hawk. One slight wild card is the director of national intelligence, who has been nominated, is Tulsi Gabbard, a former Democrat who supported Bernie Sanders in the 2016 presidential race. She has had lots of views on different things. She's accused of being very close to Putin. She met President Assad in Syria. She's a little bit of a wild card, I would say. But the asterisks that I put behind all of this is that two, really. One is Elon Musk is clearly very important to Donald Trump's orbit. If you look at the family photos coming out of Mar-a-Lago, he's the only non-family member in the family photos, and Trump's granddaughters are calling him uncle. He has business interests in China. He's very close to some Chinese politicians. He has a factory in China. He sells his Teslas into the Chinese market. So one of the huge questions is, on the one hand, you have these very tough China hawk national security officials. On the other hand, you have Elon Musk. Is he going to try and temper Trump and get Trump to return to his phase one of his China policy last time around, which was much more accommodating? And then finally, I would just say that Donald Trump himself He had 3 phases on China during his first administration. Is he going to come in tough this time from the start? Is he going to try and do a deal with China and then see how it goes? We don't know. So I think all of these picks and nominees are very important. They're signals. But at the end of the day, only one man is going to be determining China policy, and that's Donald Trump himself.
Thanks, Demetri. That really sets the scene well to come to you, Yu Jie. I mean, a few months ago, we were talking to a Chinese official who sort of put it to us that, on the one hand, for China, Trump might be good because he's transactional. On the other hand, he has no bottom line, so it could be quite unpredictable. And now we've had the election results. We're facing, the reality of a Trump second term. How's the thinking in Beijing? What smoke signals have you seen emerging about how China feels about a second-term Trump administration?
Well, there are two things from Beijing. Actually compared the congratulation letter Xi Jinping sent it to Donald Trump this round back to 2016. This round, the letter is significantly shorter and much punchier. The term seems to be far more stiff. That's to say, Xi Jinping decisively dropped the term constructive bilateral relationship. So that sense, the sense of fatalism that somehow U.S.-China relationship may not become constructive. So that's one thing. Now, secondly, in here, again, he also dropped the term long-term sustainable bilateral relationship. So by dropping long-term, again, I think that really expressed the attitude that he seems to become quite pessimistic itself on the relationship between Beijing and Washington. So that is the official level. Within the Chinese strategic community, there are two camps now has been divided on what China should to do with Trump. Of course, the first group, including our friends we speak earlier in the year and talking about how much that Trump is willing to make a deal with China, cut a deal with China, and hence China should be up for it. So there's a group of academics and commentators and continue to strongly believe so. Whereas on the other hand, I think there's also a significant group of substantive, influential scholars who work on U.S.-China relations over longer term and strongly believe that whatever the deals that Beijing come up with, it may not satisfy Donald Trump and his China hawks in the cabinet's time. So I think that we're probably going to be expecting more turbulence on the U.S.-China relations, irrespective of whatever the deal that Beijing has put forward to. And also on top of that, I think those strategic advisors also give the verdict that be wary of how a victory of Donald Trump would lead into changing environment around China's neighborhood, first and foremost, perhaps the changing nature on China-Russia relations, considering how likely Donald Trump is going to improve the relationship with Moscow in here. So I think there's a couple of things quite new, but I think overall, Beijing is not surprised Donald Trump has this resounding victory. But on the other hand, how to deal with it, and so far we have seen quite limited response from Beijing.
And to Demetri's point, do you think that Beijing will see opportunities to engage with people like Elon Musk, but also some of the other wealthy donors around Trump, like Steven Schwartzman, who are known to have good relationships with China? Will they see that as an avenue of sort of counter-influence on the Trump administration?
Well, they have always have this kind of backdoor channel ever since 1972. But to what extent that Elon Musk will cut across the China piece within the Trump administration, the answer is really we don't know. And how much Steven Schwartzman would have, the influence that would have, we don't know. And what I do know is that so far, I think Wang Yi has met Steven Schwartzman on different separate occasions well before the election and try to figure out what is going on Trump's administration themselves.
And before we dig deeper into some of the key likely tension points between the US and China, Rana, I want to come to you just for a bit of broader historical context. How do you see this period of US-China relations in the broader context of the US-China relationship? Obviously, a bit of the historical context, but also as you think about US-China over the next 10, 20, 30 years, sort of where do you think we are?
I think we are definitely at a turning point, but I think that turning point was triggered. I don't know if you could trigger a turning point, but let's stick with the metaphor for a moment there, a little while ago. And I think that point was probably a decade and a half ago, after the great financial crisis, when essentially some of the geo-economic standing that had previously been very much biased towards the United States and liberal partners and allies began to move inexorably, really, towards China and its economic sphere. And I think while I wouldn't want to suggest, unlike Karl Marx, that economics underpins everything and everything else is purely kind of on the top, nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that the change in terms of relative GDP and also what the various actors have done with it is a longer standing story. I'd say if we're talking about the wider historical context, I will predict and come back on the podcast in 25 years and check if I got it right or not, that actually we're going to talk about this, more broadly speaking, as the age of energy transition. Because I think that's actually one of the bigger Uber narratives where the China-US relationship is now taking a turning point relevant to this election, to the Trump election. The reason being that if Kamala Harris had become president, then I think it's fair to say that the current orientation of the United States towards participating in international climate change negotiations, in pushing forward the IRA, Green New Deal, these sorts of ideas, which essentially are pushing towards an economy where hydrocarbons, fossil fuels, are slowly but surely being phased out, although maybe not fast enough in terms of the planet. Donald Trump has been explicit about very few things, but I think there are really strong indications that the mix of fossil fuels in terms of what he's doing is going to be a bigger part of the mix. As people have observed, and Demetri will have more of this from DC than I could do, but he's not going to pull out the green investment that's already made, particularly in Republican Midwestern states. But that having been said, we can expect to see a lot more stress on hydrocarbons and also almost certainly pulling out of the Paris climate change accord. That, though, leaves China in an interesting position in terms of that big mega story about energy transition, because we already have the evidence that when it comes to solar panels, when it comes to a lot of the technology around wind turbines, China has already taken money, time, planning, strategy to become highly dominant in those areas. If the US is no longer really looking to use its partnerships to catch up on that, but instead go on a relatively more isolated, relatively more fossil fuel oriented path, I think that leads to a very different story in terms of where the world goes in, let's say, 15, 20 years' time, because although, again, as with everything else, we can't possibly see exactly how it will end up, that is a definite fork in the road that I think you could attribute to this iteration in the US-China relationship that wouldn't probably have happened under a different president.
Yeah, that's interesting, and it tallies with something our new colleague William Matthews is writing at the moment, arguing that while Beijing may be nervous about the unpredictability of a Trump administration, there's actually a huge opportunity for China to present itself in the medium term as a global leader on issues like climate change and technology and others. I want to drill a bit into some of the likely flashpoints, and trade's an obvious place to start, Demetri, I think, given something Trump has religion on. We're not sure what he really believes in, but one of the things he really seems to like is trade wars. Amid all the hot air of election campaigns, and especially a Trump election campaign, where do you think he and the administration is likely to go in terms of trade war with China, and I guess particularly tariffs on the rest of the world? Is this going to be very focused on China, or is this going to be really a sort of US protectionist push that hits everyone, including US allies and partners like us here in the UK?
I think, the contours are still not clear until we see particularly who takes the US trade representative job, and whether it is Bob Lighthizer, who did it before and has been asked to do it again and is very hawkish on and very supportive, I should say, of the use of tariffs as a tool. I certainly think the Europeans are going to be in the crosshairs. I mean, when I talk to officials in Asia broadly about how they see Trump, they're concerned, but they often say, we think we're going to be lower down the target list than European countries, NATO countries, and so we're not as concerned as we might have been. But on China, I think it's clear that there will be tariffs coming. I think the key question is, we don't know what percent. I mean, Trump said 60, but that will change, and other people will weigh in. But I think the key question is, does Trump come in out of the gates and slap tariffs on China straight away and then potentially try and do a deal with China? Or does he do what he did last time, is try and do a deal with China kind of quietly, potentially using people like Schwartzman or Elon Musk, and then if that doesn't work out, reverts or resorts to tariffs? And I think, frankly, nobody knows the answer to that. My sense is that he's going to be more aggressive out of the gate this time and see if the Chinese respond, because there's a lot of impatience in the Trump team at the way China handled things last time, even after they had agreed a kind of what people call a narrow trade deal. So I think this is going to be a huge flashpoint. And if Bob Lighthizer does have a key position where he has influence over tariffs, then I think you're going to see a lot of pressure coming in that direction.
And do you think he'll worry about the pain he might be imposing on US consumers? I mean, we know that concerns about inflation seem to be one of the big driving factors behind the Democratic Party's defeat. We know that Trump sort of watches the stock market going up and down like a hawk. Is that going to be a restraining factor on his trade policy, do you think?
I think there will certainly be a debate about that, and there will be people in his world arguing that. So, for example, one of the people who's a leading candidate to be Treasury Secretary is a hedge fund manager called Scott Bessent. And Bessent recently on CNBC television said that Trump would bring in tariffs gradually in a kind of a layered way. And the reason he would do that was because he would do other things on tax policy that would be deflationary, and that they would cancel out the inflationary, ramifications of tariffs. Again, as we know from the last time, Trump officials, even cabinet officials who've met with him 10 minutes previously, can say one thing about what he's going to do. It doesn't mean he's going to do it. But that's one theory of the case. The other thing is, and this is getting a little bit to something that Rana said that I think is important. If you think last time, pressure on American farmers and things like that, his ambassador to Beijing was Terry Branstad, who was a very long-serving governor of Iowa, agricultural Midwestern state. And, Branstad was one of the people who at certain points acted as a kind of a guardrail. So, for example, Stephen Miller, who's going to be the deputy White House chief of staff for policy, who wanted to ban all Chinese nationals from being able to come to the U.S. as students, was pushing that policy very aggressively. And Terry Branstad said to Trump, Mr. President, Princeton, Harvard, other Ivy League universities will be fine because they have huge endowments. The colleges that will be hit will be in Iowa and the Midwest, in Florida, the states you really need. So there will be voices pushing back. But right now, I think what we can say from all of Trump's appointments, the one thing they have in common is it doesn't strike me that there's someone who's going to strongly stand up to Trump in an aggressive way. I mean, you have a lot of loyalists. And if you see how Trump punished people the last time around who stood up to him, the impetus is for people to fall in line. So if Trump really wants to do this, even if he's told it's inflationary, I'm not sure that he's going to listen to his advisors.
Talking about a leader who surrounds himself with loyalists and punishes those who oppose him obviously makes me think of China right now. I mean, Yu Jie, how is the Chinese leadership thinking about possible trade war with the US? I mean, last time it seems the Chinese response was quite muted. There's been talk this time that China has prepared legal and other measures for retaliation. What do you think they have in store to try and deter Trump and then to respond if these big tariffs do come?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that have already been in place. Firstly, if you look into China's agriculture import recently, most of the import, especially things on soybeans, sorghums, that really has caused the issue on the first round of the trade deal. As now China has imported it from countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Russia. So already began to emphasizing that, looking for alternative sources in terms of import. So that's one level to satisfy domestic demand. I think secondly, what Beijing would have now is Beijing will really target it to go through some of the major food importers in the United States to China and then target it at those companies. So what we're likely to have is probably the first round of the trade war and the Trump 2.0 is that Beijing offer a tit for tat towards food import from the United States and to start with. And then gradually, if Washington and Beijing couldn't come with a consensus, couldn't come with an agreement, and then Beijing will slowly roll out and extend it into punitive tariff measures on critical minerals, which China does enjoy a clear monopoly in here. So I think these are the two things Beijing already in place. Now, thirdly, I think for those who follow China, know what is happening on recent and macro environment in Beijing recently, that a level of so-called non-stimulus package being introduced. I think that's a way to buffering and what yet the worst to come on the tariff impacts on U.S.-China relations. But whether those whether those buffers being offered by stimulus would be sufficient enough or not, and we don't know at this stage. And I think there's plenty of toolboxes Beijing has not really utilized yet. Probably we'll have to wait until the third week of December when this essential economic work conference to be conducted. And hence, we'll probably would know how Beijing is going to respond on a likely trade war on the economic terms.
Thanks, Yu Jie. And Rana, if you look back in history, do trade wars normally lead to hard military wars? I mean, and is that sort of where you think we are? I want to come on to the military question briefly in a second, but what's your sense of where trade wars normally go when you have two great powers sort of hitting at each other's economies potentially like this?
Economically speaking, trade wars have not generally gone well. I mean, it depends a bit how you define them. And of course, there are circumstances in which essentially tariffs and barriers are used to protect particular industries or indeed, particular types of intellectual property from being leaked across borders. But broadly speaking, the case study that people tend to look to is the interwar period between World Wars One and Two, when essentially, pretty much every country, major economy in the world, put up their barriers. The Smoot-Hawley tariff of the United States and British Empire went for imperial preference. Also, of course, an era when empires are many things, and amongst other things, they're essentially kind of forced customs unions and trade blocs. So in that sense, you do have a past history of trade wars reducing prosperity for most people and ending up with a bad outcome. That having been said, if you think about the fact that if you don't use perhaps the term trade war, but rather talk about the way in which, there are various euphemisms that could be used, managed trade is one of them, there are particular effects that come from unrestricted free trade that essentially are at the heart of an awful lot of the discontent politically that's happening around the world at the moment. And of course, Rust Belt states in the United States voting for candidates who they perceive as more protectionist is one element of that. I think what's interesting is that I think, and again, I'd be fascinated to hear what Demetri and Yu Jie have to say as well, that actually there's more of this phenomenon going on in China than we sometimes realize, because of course China, unlike these other countries, doesn't hold elections. So I hope that's not news to anyone listening to the Chatham House podcast. I think got a pretty sophisticated listenership out there, but just in case, there are no general elections in China, or not these days anyway. There were some back in the 1910s and 20s, but that was a different time. But what there is opinion poll surveys, social media, and lots of ways in which it becomes clear that actually there's a sense amongst many of the middle class and working class China's blue collars that actually, even in China, it's not necessarily a period when relatively open borders have been helpful to them. So the export of jobs, for instance, from parts of South China to Vietnam, a country which, at least in some areas, provides cheaper labor and labor that Chinese manufacturers are sometimes using. If there were Trump voters in China, and essentially there are quite a lot of Trump supporters actually in China, if you look on social media, they're angry about their jobs not being shipped to China because they're in China. They're worried about their jobs being shipped to Cambodia or to other places that have much lower wage rates. Even actually, a very interesting illustration of how freer trade can cause problems even in China, even to Eastern Africa. Ethiopia, for instance, is one place where a certain amount of very low-level manufacturing has started taking place. Those goods are then shipped across the Indian Ocean via the Belt and Road Initiative through Pakistan or other parts of the Eurasian landmass into China. Now, we're still in a world where China's manufacturing capacity is a major creator of employment and it's a major force in the global economy. But there's no doubt that the story about China being the cheapest place, which may be a different thing from the best place to manufacture, which was certainly the case in the 1990s, let's say, has moved on 25 to 30 years later. That's to be expected because human history has shown that relatively lower barriers enable people to strategize for where you can produce most cheaply and efficiently. But at the same time, there's also an awareness, as there has been in the Western world for some time, that not everyone benefits from that move up the value chain.
We've spoken about trade. I want to come to other potential flashpoints, Demetri, and talking about, I know everything is securitized these days, but talking about good old hard security, warships and maritime disputes and the like. Where do you think, if anywhere, the tensions are likely to come? Obviously people worry about the Taiwan Strait, about Taiwan, about the South China Sea, some interesting things going on with North Korea and Russia and China. And we know that Trump has history there with Kim Jong-un as well. So where do you see the likely security flashpoints between the US and China under Trump 2.0?
Well, you can almost throw a dart at anywhere in the Asia Pacific right now, and you're probably going to hit a hotspot, even if your aim is not very good. I would say in the short term, I would be very focused on the South China Sea, the Philippines, the Second Thomas Shoal, Sabina Shoal, where the Chinese military is being very aggressive against the Philippines. The Philippines have taken a huge gamble in giving the Americans access to more military bases and essentially reversing a shift that had happened under President Duterte, where he moved closer to Beijing. And now under President Marcos, he's moved back closer to the US. And the Philippines is the US's oldest defense treaty ally in the Indo-Pacific. So the Philippines are worried, is Donald Trump going to pull the rug out from under us and then expose us vis-a-vis China? So that's very important. You know, the biggest hotspot in Asia in recent years has been Taiwan. That hasn't changed. There's a lot of concern and I would say lack of clarity as to how Donald Trump really thinks about Taiwan. And he has in the past described it as a bunch of rocks in the South China Sea, and why would you bother defending them? He's also accused them of stealing the US semiconductor industry. And yet, if you look at the list of people he's nominated from Marco Rubio down to Mike Waltz, these are very strong defenders of Taiwan. So that's going to be something very, very important to watch. And I know we had a story a week ago, which is the Taiwanese are already trying to pull together a package of US weapons that they say they would like to buy to boost their defense spending, because they know that one of the things Trump is going to be laser focused on across the world, from including NATO and other countries in the Indo-Pacific, is, are countries spending enough on their defense, and is America doing too much to bail them out? But I think Taiwan is still the most sensitive issue. It's a very difficult one to manage, one that the current National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and Wang Yi have spent a lot of time discussing in their private back channel over the last year and a half or so. And the question is, how will the Trump administration tackle it? And then finally, you know, North Korea, which really hasn't factored as a subject of conversation in Washington for 3.5 years under Joe Biden, until we started to get a sign that they were going to send troops to help Russia in its invasion of Ukraine. But, you know, we all know Donald Trump was going to bomb the bleep out of North Korea until he fell in love with Kim Jong-un. So how that relationship emerges, your guess is as good as mine, but I do think that's going to be a critical one, because North Korea has had 4 more years to advance its missile and nuclear program since, or 8 years, I should say, since Donald Trump first came to office.
Even more of a case for Trump to win a Nobel Peace Prize when he brings security and stability to the Korean Peninsula, or not. Yu Jie, how is Beijing feeling on these security issues about Trump administration coming back?
Well, I mean, much agree with what Demetri said on South China Sea and Taiwan. I think we're going to see even further turbulence and even further military involvement that PLA will be operating around Taiwan Strait over there. Now, putting that to aside, I think another matter in here we have to consider is how the war in Ukraine might end it and when it will end it. And perhaps this is the only common interest that Trump administration and Beijing would have so far for now to end this war quickly. So that is one thing I put on the table. Now, another unexpected factor in here, I would say, is that intensive competition over outer space between China and the United States. Now you have Elon Musk sitting in the cabinet, and he with his own Starlink company. And I think this will be further intensify that competition between the Chinese spacecraft and the US counterpart. So I think these are 2 additional elements we shouldn't really forget in here.
And Rana, do you see on that question of security cooperation? I mean, do you see potential, for Trump and Xi Jinping to come together, talk about peace in Ukraine, maybe some sort of deal in around North Korea? I guess interesting things they could do on Myanmar if anyone cared about it. I mean, what's your sense in the potential for security cooperation?
I think that actually Yu Jie has put her finger on something very important that is probably the great unknowable in answering your question there, Ben, which is, what is the relationship between Donald Trump's America and Russia going to be like? Because if essentially there is a grand bargain of sorts being worked out, and we simply don't know at the moment, we do know that Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump have been in conversation even before, well before he's inaugurated as president, then clearly there's a conversation that has some sort of volume to it, so to speak. And in what you might think of, if you want to really kind of push far, why not? We're ahead of inauguration, we can still speculate. If you think about what you might call a reverse Henry Kissinger situation, what Henry Kissinger noticed back in the 1970s, forgive the historian for going a bit historical for a moment here, was the realization that Russia, or the Soviet Union, and the People's Republic of China, despite being socialist giants, were actually at daggers drawn, nearly going to war with each other, and that the United States had an interest in being closer to either of them than they were to each other. Now, you can't quite reverse the polarity on that in this situation, because I think it's fair to say that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, from all accounts, have become pretty close in a strange way. And again, others here may have insights on that, but in a strange way, it almost sounds as if the leaders are closer and more simpatico with each other than maybe some of the bureaucracies are in both countries, where there's more pragmatism, but also a certain amount of skepticism in both Chinese and Russian decision-making circles about how close they really want to get on everything. But a little doubt, I think, that Xi and Putin are close in some sense. So throw Donald Trump, someone who clearly, has a rapport with Putin and who Putin clearly wants to, show signs of favour to, into that mix, and I think you come up with some really hard to predict outcomes. Now, one might say that the most obvious pathway, and perhaps the one that is most likely, is that when these three get together, they realise actually they really don't like each other that much, or at least actually the United States, perhaps I'll put it this way, the United States, despite having a leader who might be more inclined to talk to authoritarian leaders, in the end is leading a democratic liberal polity which simply would find it impossible to take itself as a wholesale into that camp. On the other hand, the prospect of a grand bargain, I think, is one that would be on the minds of everyone concerned, because essentially, if you get to a place, like George Orwell's 1984, where you carve out spheres of influence, or maybe 19th century would be the way to think about it, 18th, 19th century, you can see ways in which each of those actors says, look, we operate in our own backyards, and while we're there, our major interest is keeping our own governments or regimes secure at home, and making money and growing the economy. And who can say fairer than that? That enables, at least in the short term, and one thinks that, President Trump's only got one term left. He's not going to be able to stand for re-election. So in those terms, I think making sure that he fulfills his boast that when he was in power the first time, there were no wars that broke out, and that would be the case the second time. I can see that at least for 4 years or so, you can see iterations that allow something like that to happen. But I think it's very dependent on what the United States relationship with Russia really is. And that will have huge impact on what the relationship of China is, both with Russia, of course, but also with the United States and where it chooses to make bargains.
Before we wrap up, finally, I want to do something very unfair, which is ask each of you to just give us one word that you think sums up where Trump's China policy will go based on everything we know now and accepting that there's so much we don't know. So, Demetri, the floor is yours. Your one word.
Turbulent.
Yu Jie?
Erratic.
And Rana?
Argumentative.
Great. I think that's a brilliant place to leave it. Thank you so much to our guests, Rana Mitter, Demetri Sevastopulo, and Yu Jie. You can follow them all on X or other social media platforms not owned by Elon Musk, where you can also find Chatham House. Next week at Chatham House, we have a number of events, including our 6th annual Iraq Initiative conference and a members event asking if the world can avoid a new nuclear arms race. Happy days indeed here. For the details on those events and more analysis on the US election and other important issues, please go to chathamhouse.org. You can find previous episodes of Independent Thinking on Apple, Spotify, and all major podcast platforms, as well as through our social media channels. Please like, follow, and subscribe. That's it from me today, Ben Bland. Bronwyn is back next week, so goodbye until then.